there's a couple of times now you talked about the sort of segments. So you might have a solution that fits only a small segment of the school market, and it's really really important to understand that. I think at the very beginning, and it's a little bit like you just talked about there, where you're rolling out slowly, because I think it's always in the best interest of your product to always get it out as soon as you can and iterate around it, because ultimately, you're building a solution for customers, you're not building it for yourself.
Thinking through what's the right size and unit to be an early adopter, and what can we manage, and where can we chew off the right size of things, so that you don't end up with a customer getting frustrated and wanting to walk away, or trying to break a contract, or whatever it is, often for understandable reasons. I think that's super important, because even if you then have the funds or the resilience to pushing on when you've got fed up customers is really hard. And so how you achieve product market fit and getting that balance right is tricky. You can go too far the other way though. And sometimes, because I am a believer in iterating to get things right. Assembly was 18 months in the development of its analysis tool before we rolled out beyond our third customer, for very similar reasons. I guess it creates time and space for other people to compete with you, and that's a risk for anything one is involved in. My personal view is I would rather take the time to get it right with customers. And my experience so far has been, if you get product market fit right, and I think with Assembly we really did before, with SmartGrade and Carousel, I think it would be overground of me to claim we're there yet, just because of the early stage of both ventures. But if you do take the time to get it right, your customers, your best salespeople, and your new leads come from inbound referrals from your customers advocating on your behalf. So I think there's a hard head and a soft head reason for doing it that way.
Yeah, I think the education market definitely doesn't like being sold to. I think you're right. The best marketing tool in education, especially, and probably in other B2B related businesses as well, but ultimately all markets, but ultimately advocacy and having your customers talk about you. And that means you need to show that you're willing to listen, and there's that trust element. So when they get to the point where they trust you and they're basically feel like they're being listened to, then I think you'll get that strong advocacy. And people know. And go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think that's right. And when you say the education market doesn't like being sold to, I mean, I think that is true, but I think it's in the way that none of us likes being sold to. I don't want to receive a phone call from somebody asking me if I want to buy a car or something I might want to buy at some point in my life, because when I'm ready, I'll come and find you, thank you, and buy a car. And, I think too many ed tech organizations think that if you employ a sales manager, a field salesperson, with a package with an OTE component of it that incentivizes them to sell, and if you give them enough minutes on their call plan, that somehow or other they'll get through to somebody and persuade them to buy. And I mean, I do know people that have built their businesses, successful businesses, through quite boiler room sales practices. I guess it's just not the way I would ever want to build something. I know far more businesses that have quite a disappointing return on those sales managers, because they're not necessarily people who are the most knowledgeable about the product. I know plenty of very good salespeople as well. They don't get to customers at the right time in that sales cycle, or they don't have a warm inbound lead to respond to, is probably the better way of framing it. And so they're always, engaged in the Sisyphean task of, sort of trying to push the boulder uphill. And I think actually, therefore, if you can create the inbound enthusiasm and the referral need, you might just find that you solve that problem, and you can structure your sales team slightly differently. Still with, I still think sales professionals are excellent people to have in an organization, but I think expecting them to generate on their own from nothing to magic warm leads into air is probably not quite the best way of going through what is ultimately usually a relationship sale when you're selling ed tech.
I totally agree. It is definitely, and vice versa. I don't, there's lots of people who also say, "But my product sells itself." And again, I don't think that's true either. Ultimately, you have to have that advocacy, you have to have that referenceability, and people need to understand the value of your product, which means you need to be really strong at delivering that value proposition.
Precisely. I mean, the what does it mean when people say a product sells itself, right? Like I have been really lucky for the last few years of my career to have quite a lot of inbound sales and I've led a lot of the sales, at Assembly. We had one or two other people that were involved in sales at times, but it was usually a sales process led by me. I'm not always the best salesperson necessarily, but I care about it a lot. And I want to be involved in that process. And, during that time, I would try and be out there and speaking at conferences or blogging. And, so then if you get an inbound lead, well, are they inbound, or did they read a blog that you wrote and they liked that and then they called you, right? So I think when people say a product sells itself, there's always additional work they are doing to sell it in some form, or it's probably not being successful.